Rana, and we've talked before, particularly on the rather draconian government new restrictions in Kashmir, which is, I believe, where some of your family are still. But we just said, what the organization has said, 175 journalists have died of COVID. You yourself, very sadly, have suffered the loss of family members in this latest round, this latest surge. And on top of that, even Reporters Without Borders are saying that India is 142nd on the list of the most dangerous place for a journalist to be.
Well, Christiane, I completely agree with Amanda when she says that the first target of authoritarian regimes is to basically control the source of information. As we talk, there are multiple reports in India that we have lost close to 56 journalists in the last 28 days of the pandemic. They have succumbed to COVID-19 because most of the journalists, they're also frontline warriors, are not vaccinated. They do not have the mechanisms. They do not have probably safety measures to kind of save themselves. So journalism comes last on the list of priorities. When they're not being killed for the virus, the journalists are being silenced for speaking truth to power. In India, we do not really have an independent press, so to say. So we have parallel realities in India. A reality which is shown by our domestic media, which is basically prostrating to Narendra Modi. And then there are the international media, journalists who work for the international media, who have been speaking truth to power. And which is why about a day ago, one of India's leading television networks dedicated 1 hour of its programming to calling international journalists in India, who basically write for international publications, including my cover for Time magazine, as anti-nationals who basically are on the payroll of the CIA. And not just that, Yogi Adityanath, who is the chief minister of the largest state in India, where COVID is ravaging and there are deaths upon deaths, has told journalists that if at all they report on oxygen shortage, there will be a case against her. A journalist I was speaking to yesterday, who sent me a video of close to 456 funerals in one day, requested me, begged me to not take his name in my Washington Post report, saying that if I take his name, the government will silence his voice. What does that say about journalism in present-day India, especially at a time when India is facing the worst of its humanitarian crisis? This is what we say, a Holocaust that we are living every day, as the death toll in India has crossed 4,000 deaths a day, and that's still the official figure.
Right. It is extraordinary to hear, journalists being threatened, depending on, what stories, or not to write certain stories. And I did bring up some of the sort of data, so-called denial or manipulation, with the national spokesperson for the BJP party when I spoke to him last week. But I want to ask you, Amanda, because, America has not been whiter than white, despite the First Amendment and the constitutional protections for a free and independent press. Under the 4 years of the Trump administration, it was really difficult. And the whole sort of, tarring of truth as just a load of, fake news. It was very, very difficult, and it had a bad effect and a follow-on effect around the world. So you had a personal story, you had a personal experience with this. How dangerous was it and do you think America's recouped some of its reputation, to also be tarnished with this idea, of fake news that the president himself was bandying around?
Well, Christiane, you're right. It was a very difficult time. And I take a couple of lessons from it going forward. And one is that what the United States does matters. And so the fact that Secretary Blinken is out talking about a free press, meeting with the Committee to Protect Journalists, meeting with the CEO, the acting CEO of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which runs the Voice of America, as well as other organizations, Kalu Chow, he is stating now that the United States is returning to its traditional support for a free press. What the United States does matter. When the Committee to Protect Journalists meets with governments to talk about journalists who are imprisoned, something happens. And so we can look back at the negative impact this period has had, but we can also look at the fact that one of the things that kind of saved the Voice of America during the time it was there after I had left was the fact that an entire society basically rose up to defend and protect it. Lawyers, whistleblower organizations, organizations like the Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press, other media, citizens, and in fact, legislators on both sides of the aisle. There was a fundamental understanding that a free press was important. So there's a lesson I take away from this, which is that what we do matters, and we need to make sure that in the United States we keep hold of the very unbelievably rich principle we have in the First Amendment.
So, Amanda, let me ask you about your specific personal situation, because it appeared, and you said that you were a victim, of a political sort of backstabbing. You resigned. You wrote a letter about it. Tell us, remind us what happened.
Well, I was the director of Voice of America, which is the top editor there. I'd been there for more than almost 4 years. I was appointed during the Obama administration, but continued for almost 3 years during the Trump administration, which is what the Voice of America is supposed to do. It is a non-political organization that is supposed to transcend political parties and changes in the leadership. At some point, people around President Trump and President Trump himself began to much more directly speak to the Voice of America than tweet that it was producing fake news, that it was enhancing the propaganda of the Chinese government, that we were on the side of the Chinese. And then I, along with my deputy, chose to resign because once the new director had been appointed, the new CEO of the agency that oversees all the media properties, we knew that we were going to be fired, which indeed happened to every leader of the other organizations within that group. And we felt that it was important to be able to keep a connection with the organization that we had led, to let them know that we were going to be there to support them during very difficult times. And they showed enormous bravery during that time.
And to be clear, as you said, President Biden has reversed, a lot of that. I mean, he's put in a veteran journalist now as head of VOA. But let me ask you, Rana, because we were talking a little bit about, you talked about, the pro-Modi press, for want of a better word. A couple of years ago, Freedom House said India, the world's most populous democracy, is also sending signals that holding the government accountable is not part of the press's responsibility. The media have become widely flattering of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. So we talked a little bit about that, but I also wanted to ask you, what is the flip side? What is the danger of slavishly reporting and just being praiseworthy, particularly in a pandemic? And you have seen in these local elections where there was some backlash against the ruling party at the polls.
Well, Christiane, the Indian media has been responsible for the rise and rise of Narendra Modi's popularity, including asking him questions about how does he prefer to eat his mangoes during the mango season. I mean, it's absolutely disgusting when just about in the last couple of weeks, when Indians were dying and they were requesting for oxygen on social media, the Prime Minister's social media handle was tweeting about the thousands of people who were attending his election rallies that in turn, of course, led to the surge in the second wave in India. And you see the Indian press prostrating without asking the tough questions, so much so that one of the ministers in the Modi government has got a term for journalists like us who report in international media, calling us prostitutes. Some of journalists who have been speaking to Truth to Power, including my colleague Gauri Lankesh, who translated my book in a regional language in 2017, who was shot dead outside her house. There are consequences for reporting the truth. As far as the lapdog media, which we call in India, and what's the flip side? Well, I'm sure history will be kind and objective to journalists like us, and when it's not that people do not know what the truth is, but unfortunately, these journalists, and most of them are journalists who are the Hindi language journalists, that has a huge penetration in rural India, end up listening to this narrative as opposed to we, the anglicized English media, who talk to the Wall Street Journal or the CNN, and their truth is not really as acceptable. But it's extremely unfortunate that we have this coterie of journalists in India that is hell-bent on just doing public relationships. And that's unfortunate. Journalism is dying a slow death. We say India is on a ventilator at this point of time when we are dying for the lack of oxygen. I think journalism in India is on ventilator. Even at a crisis like this, when the government is fudging data, the government, like for instance, the government says there are 4,000 deaths in a day. Multiple local journalists have been sending out reports and sending out data which points out that there are at least 10 times the number of deaths that the government is putting across. Still, there is not a single question from India's mainstream media as to why is Narendra Modi not taking a single press conference? Why is he not taking the tough questions from the Indian media? Why has the Prime Minister of the world's largest democracy not taken a single press conference in the last 6 years? You know, Indian journalists were praising the New York Times when the New York Times published the names of all the deceased who died of COVID-19 last year, and they were all praising. Why is something like that not being done by Indian publications? Why is Modi not being asked the tough questions on the front page of our newspapers? In fact, when Joe Biden offered help to India, the headlines in Indian newspapers was Narendra Modi makes Joe Biden prostrate before India. That's what the headline is. That's what the posturing is. And you can imagine, but are these the only journalists? No.
Okay.
There are unsung journalists. There are many unsung journalists who are doing an unpopular journalism, Christiane, and the world must laud their efforts. I stand all journalists in India who are bringing the truth at this point of time with great personal risk to their life. I'm proud of my colleagues.
I mean, yes, there's a huge amount of, we should say, great work coming out. But I want to ask you, Amanda, because the Modi government, since we're talking about India, last week asked Twitter and Facebook to take down certain postings that they deemed unflattering to them, and they said it was spreading disinformation. The government did. So I want to ask you, because this year, UNESCO's theme for World Press Day today is information as a public good. Have you thought about how journalism can survive and navigate as a public good when, as we were discussing with Senator Klobuchar, we live in this era of digital dominance and social media dominance and this exponential ability to pass along information that may or may not be true and often isn't?
Well, Christiane, I can address that a little bit, and that is that yes, there's several pieces to this. One is kind of trying to figure out how you handle this fast-moving, gigantic system, and how you deal with the clearly burgeoning amount of disinformation. But there's another piece to that, and that's the place where I think that I can be of the most use, and that is looking at the piece of the reliable, truthful, professional news media that is, because of financial issues, is just really collapsing. And so there's both pushing back at disinformation and there's also providing good information. And both of those things are under threat right now. My personal choice is to spend my time trying to deal with providing the good information, filling up a system with something that is losing increasingly now. I think there's a lot of work for other people to do in pushing back on disinformation, as we've just heard.
Indeed. And of course, the Indian government, every time we bring this up, they always deny attacking journalism. But it's really, really an important discussion today on World Press Freedom Day. Rana Ayyub, Amanda Bennett, thank you so much for joining us.